This is Tom's screen for the predominant component of it. And then I'm up here in the right corner. We're going to be talking about Space Force. Tom, do you want to give the agenda real quick?
Well, yeah. Trump just announced this the reinstatement of the Space Command. The Space Command isn't anything particularly new. Anybody who's ever heard about NORAD, which is like the major North American missile defense, communication network, that's all part of the same rubric, really. So that's not particularly new. But the announcing that there's going to be a Space Force, like a new wing of the military, that is kind of new. For a long time, it's kind of been American policy to do the civilian thing and the military sort of shared space, and that's a little bit about what the Space Command is. It's really kind of a coordination of current assets. But the Space Force, now we're talking about maybe somebody who's going to take space away from the other armed forces. And, it's a gigantic, ridiculous government. It's so freaking huge. All these different interests are working against each other. I thought we'd talk about some of the basics of this geopolitical nonsense so that when we start speculating about what it all means, everybody has a pretty good idea, what the configurations are, you know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
And there may be some surprises. There's a few things out there, a few types of equipment that we can speculate about what they're going.
Right. And
we can report on some of the things they told us about, but knowing what's out there and some of the things that might be out there will also give us all, some idea of what the ambitions might be. So here I'm looking at there's a 1962 video game, probably the first one ever, called Space War. It's basically like asteroid dodgeball. So instead of shooting asteroids, it's you and another guy, and you got to shoot each other, and you got missiles. It's not going to be like that.
no.
Anybody. So let me tell you about this thing that Buckminster Fuller thought of.
And real quick Buckminster Fuller, for people who are unaware of who Buckminster Fuller is, do you want to just do a 30-second hit on that and then?
Well, yeah, because I think we should use Google Earth to sort of talk about this global question of Space Force, Space Command. Buckminster Fuller, back in the 40s to the 50s, he suggested that we hang a 200-foot sphere between the Brooklyn Bridge and the UN building in Liberty Island in order to project with projectors or maybe with little computer-controlled lights. He wasn't clear on exactly what would be better. And this is in the 40s and 50s, before computers were really doing anything. And it was his theory that if we put up videos of weather patterns and shipping patterns and temperature patterns and who the hell knows what, all the people looking up there would see things in these patterns, and who knows what we discover. And of course, Google Earth now does that in your phone if you want to, where you can just sort of look at all these patterns over time and geography and the water and everything else. And it's a really great tool. And I thought we'd start there to talk about the Space Command. What we're looking at. This is just to give us all an idea about the scale, like what exactly we're talking about. And as you can see, I'm looking at some cars. This looks like an air conditioner over here. Not sure what that is. This looks like a loader or something, right? Here's something like a big piece of equipment. Here's a couple more cars.
Yeah.
This looks like a trailer maybe with some doorway, right? All right. Well, what this is right now is like a little corner of one of the launch complexes at Cape Canaveral in Florida.
Interesting.
So here's the towers, and we got all this sort of subterranean and roads everywhere, and this stuff. I mean, just this thing alone, I didn't even know how much this would cost. And this is just one little piece of Cape Canaveral. You can see there's 3 more, 4 more. There's strings of them, dude. They just go and go and go. And here's the major, and there's a string of them down here. All these different little launch spots. This is Cape Canaveral, where the space shuttle launched.
Right.
When people go to look, they're way over here at the tourist zone across this giant river from the whole.
Yeah, I've driven that before. I mean, I've been to Cape Canaveral. Yeah, I know right what you're talking about.
Right on. And so Cape Canaveral, the reason it's such a good place to launch is because the downrange is the ocean. So if anything goes wrong, it doesn't land on anybody.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
And when you talk about space, there's all sorts of places that are good for that. All throughout the the Caribbean, these are all great places to launch. You might wonder, if these guys could get the support, maybe this would be a good place for a launch station. Brazil would really like to be part of the launch situation. They're near the equator, which is actually an energy advantage.
But to like the space, well, no, you go ahead, keep going.
Well, all I was going to say is that when you talk about the space originally started, space concerns originally started because of missiles. NORAD exists to be aware and try to answer anything that's going to be coming over the poles. And that's exactly the point. Right over the pole is where the rest of the world is. Like, it's real easy to sort of think of the map as this flat thing, but when you're talking about the space concern, like, no one's trying to get down here to this part of the world.
Right. So
the action is all up in the north, and so when you talk about like the military high ground, Trump's recent talk about Greenland may have everything to do with this idea of Space Command. The fact is, the U.S., like a lot of other states, has its fingers everywhere. We have this network of boats and this network of energy and this network of information. So just like China has similar ambitions, Trump is certainly talking about being the leader in space because it's so much easier to defend a planet than a piece of a planet.
Well, and this is what brings me to what I would say one of my first just knee-jerk concerns with kind of a space force that's a military-based force is information control, just control in general. I've never seen, for me, there's two reasons why conquering occurs. It's for control of populace and control of information. Those are the two things. And I don't see, and that's the number one concern about a government for me when it comes to this, government space force, frankly.
Well, and one possibility why this is happening is because all of a sudden the U.S. has some kind of new equipment. The U.S., with the loss of the shuttle, by 2013, I mean, the shuttle has been absolutely mothballed. There's been nothing particularly on the front burner for the U.S. to actually have anything massive going on in space. There may be something that's happening that's making that change, and Trump is preparing to.
So
at the same time that we talk about the militarization of space, it was only a few years ago that Virgin Galactic built the first private spaceport.
Right.
And although Virgin Galactic had real issues 3 years ago with their crash, they're back to testing their interplanetary space plane. They've got a vehicle that doesn't throw anything away.
So
just like Elon Musk with SpaceX doing the same work with new launch technology.
And that's what, and you're right, and that kind of reminds me of some things we were talking about earlier today, which is kind of looking backward a little bit at where we are that has us here today. You've seen some privatization, some individual, like SpaceX is a great example, getting into space from the private market, private sector. What kind of concerns are there? Let's use an analogy of sorts. If you were to look at this from a risk board perspective, right? I mean, just your knee jerk. What do you? Are you in favor of the Space Force from a government perspective? What's your take, or I guess opinion on all of that?
Oh man, I got all sorts of opinions about space. All I'm aiming for today is to see if we can figure out, what the different concerns might be. The fact is, private space spending has been greater than government for 2 decades.
Right.
96 is when private spending started outstripping public spending.
And to give perspective to that, when you talk about in the medical field breakthroughs, the more breakthroughs have occurred actually as private spending went up. So in other words, private spending in a sector indicates growth or progress being made versus public.
And we can dream about a future, however we can get there, where used spaceships are kind of cheap, and anybody who has the skills and guts, can make a go of it on this or that, different sort of operation. We can, if you like, some of the links that we put up gives you some of those visions, and even in the movies that we see, the military is all part of it from the get-go.
Do you want to hit play on this? Is this one you want to
see that?
This is a great flick, Elysium here. Do you want to hit play on this?
In this crash scene, we got the bad guy and the terrorist, but they show as a backdrop this giant space colony, which is one guy's vision about how we might live in space. There's issues with radiation, but there's technical ideas to deal with that, and how we get to that world, one way or the other, or whether we get to that world, may depend on private versus public spending. As we see it now, the U.S. military is basically losing a war of attrition in the Middle East because you take $1 billion piece of equipment and it's operated by 4 guys that you spent $1 million training, and a teenager with $100 bomb fucks it all up. Like, we can't maintain that.
So
the fact is, this high-tech, awesome idea can't really be sustained on a non-consensual basis.
So when you bring up, whether we get to, achieve a level of progress to where, there's this almost easy interaction, or not easy, but more simple interaction between space and Earth and people on it, public versus private. My first concern that comes up with Space Force as being discussed is just public versus private. I don't see how you get to the best result by having more public spending and more public restriction or military, occupation, right? I mean, military occupation limits the ability for privatization. It doesn't expand it, right?
Well, it tends to. And there may be one possibility for what Trump is doing, is he's seeing the private concerns sort of get ahead of the government. The fact is, governments don't really accomplish much in space. There's talk about mining asteroids, and we have Elon Musk in 10 short years has absolutely destroyed the government mandated space systems in terms of his safety record. His launch record is outrageously better than the government. Even Virgin Galactic with their awful crash is still way ahead of the game. Apollo 1, 3 guys died in the launch pad. And that was only 3 programs into the giant Prestige machine. And what did the Prestige machine get us anyway? So this
is what really drives Space Force to a much larger philosophical question of how much involvement should any government entity have in such a revolutionary for all of humanity kind of role, right? I mean, because it's not just a United States or China or whatever role here. Whoever can truly help colonize the sky in some sense, right? That's a
as soon as you talk about global in space, you are necessarily talking about a complete system, and that's the thing, is that whatever's going to happen in space, if we're going to predict it or deal with it or be ready for it, it's going to have to be in terms of a global view, because it's a global thing. Now, just out of curiosity, when you're looking at this picture, and can you see my finger there is like hanging around that horizon?
Your finger? Yeah, I see the mouse. Yeah.
Yep. That's about how high most of the equipment we're talking about is.
Okay.
We're talking about Space Command. We're talking about something that's like this little teeny halo around just the outskirts of the Earth. One of the animations.
Just the sound of that to me sounds like a warden almost. If that's government Space Force with that thin kind of line, kind of circulating it, that doesn't sound appealing to me. That sounds like a warden. It doesn't necessarily sound like protection. It sounds, what's the difference between a good wall and a bad wall? A bad wall is meant to keep people in. Good wall is meant to keep people out. In other words, it seems like
you know who you're talking about, right? With that idea.
Who?
What's his name? The conspiracy guy. His website's name is Prison Planet.
Oh, no, I don't know.
Idea.
James Watson or something. There's a James dude, but no, I'm not talking about any of that. I'm strictly referring to what I think of if you're talking about the equipment for military use is that high above, then I don't know who's going to be in charge of that military use 20 years from now. And thus, even if its intended use is protection or innovation, how can I be assured if it's a government entity that it's not one day, 20 years in the future, flipped to a controlling, not allowing private sectors into space, right? Because that, of course, would be the biggest issue.
And whoever has control, quote unquote, we're always going to have to wonder what their intentions are. There's legal precedents.
Well, this
NASA
on precedent,
takes NASA and NORAD and some conglomeration of U.S. government entities basically claims all the airspace over that side of the world.
Well, this brings me, and I'll make this a quick analogy. But when you said precedent, one analogy I mentioned it to you earlier. Back when I debated on the U.S. Patriot Act, it wasn't even the fact that I disagreed overall with the premise of, what the intended use was. It was the reality that you have no way of predicting the next 5 hands to touch the Patriot Act and how those 5 hands will apply those same precedents. So the objective, I believe the objective for people who are in a democracy or republic or, a democratic republic is to limit the ability of government to have controlling components, not expand it. And this seems like an expansion to me.
Well, it certainly is. And again, because we're talking about, the whole globe, like the expansion is finally, treating the globe as a system. And Trump making the move on Greenland makes me think that he's wise to that. So there's 2 main things that we're talking about.
What's the connection with Greenland?
Space. I'm sorry, what?
What's the connection with Greenland with this?
Greenland's the high ground.